proceeded from there to the mountain that is east of Bethel, pitched his tent there, with Bethel on the west and Ai. So Bethel and Ai are the other two cities there on either side there. He built an altar of the Lord. Abraham journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. So the Negev is south of Hebron. It'll be a little better on the next map we'll look at. Negev simply means south. So it is the southern region. It is also a desert region. So anytime you see the Negev, that is just the southern part, kind of the Bible lands. Extremely dry, horrible-looking desert stuff that's down there, except for the stuff that's along the water that actually flows into the Dead Sea. Abram then will travel over to Egypt. That's chapter 12, verse 10. There was a famine in the land. Abram went down to Egypt, for the famine was severe. Then he will turn around and head back up and will kind of spend most of his life up around Hebron and Shechem again. So there's kind of the map to kind of get us an idea here. And by the way, from Ur of the Chaldees to Hebron is about 1,000 miles. So this is a long journey. This isn't a day journey. This is a month journey. So a lot of traveling there for them. Okay. Now, some of the other ladies that are associated with Abraham then are this next set of three that I want to look at: Sarah and Hagar and Keturah. Now, again, if you're like me, Sarah and Hagar are pretty common to us. We're familiar with them. But Keturah, maybe not so much. So, before we get into the story of these three ladies and their connection with Abraham, I want to ask three quick trivia questions. So I want for you to answer these and get your answer in your mind, and then we'll be answering these as we go through. So, Abraham trivia. How many wives did Abraham have? Now, you look up there and there are three listed, but that might be a trick. Okay? So, how many wives did Abraham, at least how many wives is recorded that Abraham had? Number two, how many children did Abraham have? I would have missed this one last week. How many children did Abraham have that we know of? And then number three, how old was Abraham when he married his last wife? So that one is kind of an approximation, but we know pretty close as to how old he was. Okay, so get your three answers in your mind. We'll answer these as we go through this particular part of the study. All right, so here's kind of map number 2. This one I liked a little better because you can see on the map there the land of Canaan. You can see Shechem, and then you can see Bethel and Ai, and then you can also see Beersheba, which plays a role. Abraham will spend some time down south. There's the Negev in the bottom, Kadesh Barnea, which will also pop up in the historical text. And there's one other location that will actually be on the northern part. If you go all the way up to Haran, which is all the way at the top, and I can't remember the name of it. We'll run across it here in just a minute. That will actually be north of that. So there's one other region that will be clear on the north side of Haran here in just a minute that some guys will travel to. All right, so let's talk about these three: Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah. First of all, let's talk about Sarah. Let's just kind of bring some general facts that we know about Sarah. Well, first of all, she was Abraham's half-sister. So that's found in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 12. He'll make that comment when he's trying to justify his lying, but he will say, no, really, she is my sister. She's a half-sister, but she is. Second thing about Sarah, and we've talked about beauty and how big a role that it plays for some reason in this section in Scripture. Sarah was a beautiful woman. Look with me at chapter 12 in verse 4. Now, what I want to point out in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 4, it says here that Abraham was 75 years old when he departed for Haran. So he's leaving Ur of the Chaldees and going north. And if he is 75, what we know about Sarah is she's 10 years younger, basically. So she is 65 years old when they leave, okay? So for most of us, at least especially in our culture, by the time you get to 65, you're you're kind of past your prime. You think, I better hush. So, but 65 is not a young chicken anymore. Now, if you go over to, down in this passage, go down to verse 11. So they travel up to Haran, and then they go down. They end up down in Egypt now. And verse 11 says, it came about when they came near to Egypt that he said to Sarah his wife, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and then they're going to kill me so they can have you. Basically is what Abraham tells her. So then, of course, they tell this fib while they're in Egypt. She's 65 years old. She is so beautiful still at 65 that Abraham's afraid that the Egyptians are going to kill him to get her. Then, if you'll go over to Genesis chapter 20, so this is the second time that Abraham tells this same fib. This time it is to a fellow by the name of Abimelech. And Abimelech is not really a name, it's more of a title, because we run into a guy named Abimelech later, which cannot be the same guy, because this guy's got to be dead at that point. So Abimelech is really more of a title, but at any rate, Abraham does the same thing. He and Sarah does the same thing when they're among the Philistines with Abimelech, and the reason he does is because he thinks she is so beautiful, they're going to kill him and take her then. And she's 90 then. So I just want to point out that Sarah was a beautiful woman here. And I think that's significant as this whole thing plays out. And you're going to see why as we travel on down this study. That this is a common theme that runs throughout this. Again, as we've already mentioned, beauty has two sides. It has a great side, and it has kind of an evil side. And we see both of them here, don't we? As Abram and Sarah lie, as somebody, she's so beautiful they're going to kill me and steal her. That's not a good thing. But I'm sure Abraham loved that he was married to that he had a beautiful bride, as I am. So, that's it all. There's this duality of some of these things. All right, point number 3. Sarah was barren until the age of 90. So not only was she barren till the age of 90, by the time she's at 90, she is past the childbearing age, Scripture says. So she really remained barren all of her life. Went through the change, and then God miraculously fixes her when she's 90 so that she can have a child. So this idea of her barrenness is a little bit unique. We're going to find out that her 2 daughters-in-laws later will also be barren, but they won't be barren until the end of things. Okay, so we'll get there in just a minute. Sarah gave birth to Isaac at the age of 91, and then Sarah will die at the age of 127. And what's kind of sad about this, and we'll look at this event in a little bit more detail, she dies at 127 and she never gets to meet Rebekah. And Rebekah is also going to be a very beautiful woman. Of course, Abram will find Rebekah for him after the death of Sarah. And it's just kind of a shame. You mamas know how much you love your daughters-in-laws. And she just never got to meet Rebekah. Again, just kind of interesting things about Sarah. Now, her counterpart, the counterpart of Sarah, is, of course, Hagar. Sarah had an Egyptian maid named Hagar. Sarah had been barren. Her and Abram had been married for 10 years. She realized she is not going to have a child. And Sarah takes Hagar, who was her maid, and gives Hagar to Abraham. Now, there is no record that I could find throughout the historical record here that Abraham ever marries her. Okay? He brings her. Hagar gets pregnant by Abraham, gives birth to Ishmael. Turn back to Genesis chapter 16. I don't want to read this entire section here. But here's kind of the information that we just kind of summarized in those first couple sentences. Verse 3, Abraham lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. Abram's wife Sarah took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram it says right there, as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. So as this kind of grows after this, remember that Hagar runs. I think she's probably running for her life at this point. God has to intervene and sends Hagar back to the household. So as the angel is talking to Hagar, if you look at verse 10, moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. So the same promise that God gave to Isaac, he is going to fulfill in Ishmael as well. The angel of the Lord said further, behold, you are with child. You will bear a son, and you will name him Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all his brothers. So this is kind of a sad commentary on Ishmael. He is going to be a man that nobody likes. He doesn't like anybody. Nobody likes him. He is going to live in the land east of the land of Canaan there. We're going to find out there will be another group that's going to join him. Matter of fact, Esau's group will join him in the east. And of course, we're familiar with what happens with the group in the east. They end up with a totally different type of religion. They end up being very difficult people. And a lot of it, I think, stems from the fact that that's just how they came into being, through Ishmael and Esau both. Let's see, turn over to Genesis chapter 21. Genesis 21, down in verse 9. So when we get to Genesis chapter 21, Sarah gives birth to Isaac. So the promise has been fulfilled. Sarah gives birth to Isaac, and for some reason Hagar is not, I guess she is now jealous that Sarah finally had a child, and especially under the circumstances with which she has this child. So verse 9, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. So Ishmael is, and I don't know, apparently he is perhaps mocking Isaac. He may be mocking Sarah. Again, we're not real sure the specifics of this event. Verse 10, therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son, but God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. And of the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. So Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread, skinned water, gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, gave her the boy, and sent her away. She departed and wandered around in the wilderness of Beersheba. And then there's kind of the event here. If you'll go down to verse 20, God was with the lad and he grew. He lived in the wilderness and became an archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And then later, over in chapter 25, we find out that Ishmael then with the Egyptian will have 12 children, which again I think is interesting that there's also 12 boys, 12 sons that are mentioned. They all become princes, and he becomes father of a great nation. So Abraham then will become father of both sides of this. And by the way, if you read know anything about the Quran, they go all the way back to Father Abraham. So that's where the lineage split. His descendants fill the land of the east towards Egypt and Assyria. And he lived, according to Genesis chapter 25 and verse 18, in defiance of all his relatives. So we can see this conflict between the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac. And so he'll live east. There's going to be basically this huge battle that's going to take place between the brothers. There's one good New Testament connection between Sarah and Hagar. Again, we are probably all familiar with this, but this is found in Galatians chapter 4. So if you would, hold your finger here in the book of Genesis, go on over to Galatians chapter 4. Let's take a look real briefly at this. So there is a connection between the Sarah and Hagar mess, if you will, with all this. Galatians 4:21. As Paul's writing to the church at Galatia, he says, "Tell me, you who want to be under law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman and one by the free woman. But the son of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, the son of the free woman through the promise. This is allegorically speaking, for these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves, that is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother." So again, there's just a neat connection there as we think about the New Testament. We think about our lives as Christians. It goes back directly to those two ladies, is the illustration that the Apostle Paul gives. If you look real quick, Galatians 4:31, "So then, brethren, we are not children of a bondwoman, but out of the free." So when we are baptized into Christ, we receive the blood of Christ, we move from slavery into freedom. So we move from being a child of Hagar to a child of Sarah, again, which is a beautiful picture there, a beautiful connection that goes back to the book of Genesis. I think we got time real quick to finish up this little section before the next bell, perhaps. If you'll go one more time to Genesis chapter 25, Sarah dies back in chapter 23. Abraham finds a wife for Isaac, who will be Rebekah, we'll look at next week. And then in chapter 25, verse 1, "Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah." So after all of this has happened, Abraham takes another wife, and then if you'll look, she bore to him an entire set of sons. And there's their names. I don't know if I got that on the next slide. I do not. Seems like, is there 6 of them listed or 8? I've lost the number there. 6. 6 listed from Keturah. So Abraham has a total of how many sons that we know of? Well, 8 by name. Okay? And then 10 of his grandsons will be listed under this lineage with Keturah. So we've got a whole other thing going on here. We don't know nothing that I could find about the rest of this side of the lineage. As far as how old Abraham when he married Keturah, if I did my counting up right, and I reserve the right to be wrong, he was about 147 when he took his final wife. That seems kind of old to me, to be getting remarried and then having a whole set of kids. But that's Abraham. So Abraham ended up with 3 wives, Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah, and a set of 8 sons that we have names for, and then a huge set of grandsons and multiples after that. All right, any other questions or comments about this little set of ladies? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting that Hagar was spoken to by God 2 times.
That's right. She was not, There's a whole nother story about Hagar in there. There's a whole study here. And we don't have time to get into that today, but it's interesting. Not only does God talk to her on 2 different occasions, but God blesses her. God did not have to do that. Over and above what he was required. The only thing he did was make a promise to Abraham about Isaac. And God blesses Ishmael anyway, although Ishmael turned away from a lot of those blessings that God gave him. And then there's this whole idea of sin and giving your maid to be your wife for your husband. It's crazy, a lot of that stuff. And we're going to talk about this next week, I think, at the end of our discussion about how God is able to work some amazing things in spite of us. God is able to do great things, and that should be a powerful lesson for us. That's a good thing, that God does great things in spite of us. So let's end right there, and we'll pick up with Rebecca next week.